Ontology of Nought is the fourth full-length album from Berlin, Germany-based avant-garde death metal band Ingurgitating Oblivion. And we could qualify their sort of title and their subgenre with a lot of different niches over the years. They started out as an offshoot of Florian Engelik's his interest in exploring black metal, as well as the peaceful three kind of sound that had emerged over that time, as well as, of course, the connection between some of those things you could find in an Opeth record. So they very much were a progressive-minded unit to start. They put out two album-length CDRs that were essentially demos and all original material that was very focused, often somewhat technical, but certainly it was progressive death metal or progressive black and death metal, depending on the album. So that all changed when the name changed, or when Engelk took things into his own hands and started his own group, and that became Ingurgitating Oblivion. So that first demo tape under this new name was very different. It was much more clearly influenced by movements in uh, technical death metal and progressive death metal at the time. You could definitely feel that there was a strong affinity for immolation and the more dissonant phrases they were pushing out in the early 2000s and the late 90s. You could definitely feel the paradigm shift that Gorguts had offered around the same time, but then the foundation of the way they pinned together their performances and composed the drums all centered around Morbid Angel's style, which was close to brutal death metal, but it wasn't exactly anywhere near the Opeth-like progressive black and death metal that they were playing early on. So this was quite a different focus, but something that was equally astute for the time. It was uniquely technical and a style that we don't see as much anymore. We see a lot of bands sounding like Morbid Angel, but less in that sort of technical amplification of that style. So that first demo really informed their first record, and they've kind of ramped up since then in a lot of different ways. But the debut LP was definitely a starting point. It really was a kind of brutal death metal era release. It was something that was kind of slapped out and aggressive, but very strong in the way that it showed its ability to keep up. And so the times had changed in brutal death metal, and that meant that their focus shifted to something that was a little bit more uh, interesting and close to their developing skill levels, which was almost a 10-year path all the way to continuum of absence. The way that I'd always viewed the return of this band was basically that records like Colored Sands had happened, and that meant there was this huge boon in musicians putting out records in a style that was similar and influenced by Obscura and whatnot. And the call for those types of records and the popularity of them allowed the band to kind of get their foot in, and people started paying attention to what they were doing. It wasn't as common then as it is now, but it certainly was within the realm of style and substantive performances that were angular, dissonant, and very wrought and aggressive. When we consider those beginnings for this band, I think it's important to take a look at where they started, which was, it wasn't necessarily mundane, but it was a long process of development that found the end goal of all of that work was actually kind of easily pigeonholed into a certain school of death metal that was technical and progressive and avant-garde in its abstraction of rhythmic forms. And I think that meant that the phrasal language of the band had become peak for its time, but there were so many bands like that that it really wasn't such an explosion in the mind to run into a group like that. They kind of fit into the Willowtip roster very well at the time, and if you were a fan of like Ulcerate or whatnot, they certainly stood out for you, as they did me, and that was kind of when I noticed the band and appreciated them. The important thing is that they took a huge leap. They took a big step beyond that point with Vision, Wallows, and Symphonies of Light. Now you could skip the past discography when approaching Ontology of Nought. I wouldn't recommend it, but you really could. There's a couple of key things I wanted to point out by going over the full discography. Was that some things that the composers have written into this new album actually call back to some of their earliest recordings they'd ever done, and while the structure may look similar to Vision, Wallows, and Symphonies of Light in terms of long, protracted compositions that are abstract but still death metal, there's pure abstraction on this album to the point where we listen to a clip right now, it's really, it might not even read as music, there's just a certain aspect of it that 15 seconds is never going to really clip out and get an essence of. These are quite long pieces, and even just attempting to describe what happens on this album took some time to consider because it's going to be abstract no matter what. So we'll get to a clip here, and then I'll talk about what this record is and what the value is to this experience the way that I see it. There were premonitions of the ambitions of this record on the previous one in the sense that there were vocal chorales, there were long form pieces, there were use of dissonant and jagged chords to ring out and sort of sustain through a lot of the multi-guitar passages that led to ultimately it was still technical death metal. And I think the thing to say about this new album is that it escapes death metal in a way that it blurs the line between noise, pure abstraction, obsessive performances, complete disharmony of functional units, and on top of that, there's this very strong progressive rock and progressive metal side to the rhythms here. There's a very strong jazz influence to certain pieces, and you kind of find there's this noir thread of dissonant but also sort of jazzy snapping hum to some of it as we pass through the full thing. And I think the way that they pull this off with any style at all is by the rhythm section that they've got here. And Lily Gruber is a very well-known drummer for Defeated Sanity, just a huge presence on this album and the last one. And so I think that's a big presence to start with. But then you get Chris Zukas, who is the session bassist for this album. He's in a thrash metal band, Violent Definition, and a power thrash metal band, Sacral Rage. You really should know both of those bands if you're a fan of old school thrash metal, whether you like Agent Steel or whatnot. But the important note to make here is that these are very talented musicians who've added a lot of their own personality to the rhythms here, which is still not anything usual. It's still completely abstracted to the point where they're kind of their movements, their sweeps, their chunks of sound and chaos, and but they're also death metal songs too in a progressive sense, without the sweetness of traditional progressive death metal. There isn't a performative touch to this record in the same way that you think of when you think of progressive death metal. But when it comes to dissonant technical death metal, I think that's where they'll find a lot of their fandom here, because there are really pretty insane guitar work all over this thing, but also the vocals that come in. I think if you remember the haunting sort of choirs they used on Thantaxophath's EP from a couple of years ago, Void Masquerading as Matter, you'll appreciate how far the vocals go on this record. And to the point where they're the main feature of at least one very long song. Ultimately, this is a very challenging record, and one that is never disparate. It's always engaging, but also it's very much the fading in and out of a fever dream, a collapse of foundation. This is a real abstraction of death metal. It's a real abstraction of heavy music in a way that calls upon a lot of non-metal influences to make that work and to pin it all together. So when I say there's a jazz fusion influence, that'll be obvious for about 2 minutes out of a 20-minute song, and then you'll find that it really was threaded throughout in a smart way to make sure the whole thing was glued together, but it was still all broken and shattered on the floor the entire time. I describe it as dementia-inducing. There's certainly a crazed, affected way that this record presents itself, and I think when you consider how much the band has evolved their intent and changed their sound since 2017, this is both directly sensical as a follow-up, but also completely more than, it's more than a staircase away from where we were before. This is a huge leap into a different portal altogether, and every song is completely different. And so the voice of Ingurgitating Oblivion is now almost like it's working with metadata. It's almost like a wild AI has gone off, and they're just creating these kind of horrifying songs that have moments of brilliant feats, which are just atypical in every case. So if they were more active, if they were more technical, if they touched upon more notes per minute, I think that a lot of people would be able to connect with that on a more directed level. But because this is a record of chaos and crafting it from broken pieces, I think that this is a hard record to connect with on a personal level so much as experience in awe and horror. And I think that's kind of where the best of avant-garde music comes from, is you can't really, there is no foundation to really lock into, but you know that you're listening to a death metal band and very talented extreme metal musicians putting on a show. So there's much more to it. You're really going to have to listen to the album to really get it. But what I will say is that this is one of the best records of the year in terms of abstract and avant-garde heavy music, and especially if you're a fan of extreme metal. There's so much care and thought put into this record in terms of its composition, the feelings that it evokes, and the complex path that it takes. There's nothing else like it. There are things that certainly have a little bit of that DNA in some of their movement, but most other records in this style will sound obsessive and singular and set in one way, whereas the expanse offered here is exponential beyond their last record, and I think that's something that you don't really see in a lot of extreme metal bands, where it's not just a leap, but it's a creation in exponent, where it couldn't get any bigger, it couldn't get any more demented and broken, otherwise it just wouldn't be music. So I really appreciated that. I think it's very unique. It makes for a unique listening experience, and one that is effective in whatever it might conjure for the person. You know, you might just be frustrated at the end of this record, but it's still very much worthwhile from my point of view. So again, that's one of the best records of September. Expect to see it on my best of September list, and go ahead and check it out yourself. It released on September 27th, and read my review if you'd like more of my thoughts in depth.
With this